Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you are new here, my name is Chris Hong and I am an artist. And in today's video, I decided to revisit an old idea of mine and turn it into an illustration. If you've ever watched my last sketchbook flip through video, which was posted years ago now, you may recognize this little sketch of a crying clown character that is being offered a tissue by her teddy bear friend. And judging by the other drawings around the sketch, I want to say that this was done around the end of 2019. So the idea is at least 5 years old. It's a super simple idea, but I really liked the drawing, so I always knew that I wanted to come back to it one day. And what's interesting is that I don't remember sharing this drawing outside of doing the flip through of my sketchbook, but I recall seeing a number of people do studies of it and create their own kind of versions of this drawing, so I like to think that it resonated with others as well. For this illustration, I decided to use, you guessed it, watercolors. I wanted that ever elusive, whimsical feel that you get with watercolor paintings, and I thought that the abstract, void, space kind of background would be the easiest to achieve with watercolors. I did 2 color comps in watercolor, and they're both pretty much identical, except one has a red outfit and the other has a cyan blue outfit, and I worried that the cyan blue would get lost a little bit against the blue background, and even though the blue hues would be different, I just worried that it would feel a little bit washed out, so I ended up going with the red color scheme, but it was a really tough decision. So to start, I go in with the character first. I knew that the character is in the light, so I keep the values light and my paint quite diluted. And since I know the background is going to be blue, I imagine that the blue of the background would affect the character. So I start by applying blue from the edge, and then while the paint is wet, I switch to using warmer skin tone colors to fill out the rest of the shape. And I drop in warmer oranges and pinks in certain areas like the cheek and the ear and the elbows while the paint is still wet to create that wet on wet effect and as to not create any hard edges. So at this stage, I'm just filling in the shapes one by one with their respective local colors. So I actually deluded myself into thinking I could do this painting in just 1 or 2 layers for the character and 1 layer for the background. Yeah, no. Spoiler alert, I definitely used more than 1 layer for the background, but deluding myself into thinking that that is how I was going to approach this painting, it actually made me a bit more bold in applying my colors because I was applying the color that I think was going to be the final color in the end, instead of what I usually do when it comes to watercolors, which is I will start light at first and then gradually build up to the color that I think is going to be the final result color. So I guess working more indirectly, typically. So trying to minimize the amount of layers that I use by actually going in fairly boldly right from the start. And I think what I am doing is using a bit more of an alla prima approach. In oil painting, alla prima is when you are working basically while the paint is wet and you finish the painting while the paint is wet, and it is a much more direct approach to painting as opposed to painting indirectly, which would be more like building up an underpainting and then waiting for that layer to dry, and then once it's dry, you can glaze other colors over top. And yeah, if I think about it like that, I've definitely been using a more indirect approach with watercolors. So I am now trying to approach it in a more alla prima way and see if I yield better results. So as I am filling out the local colors, I was struggling a little bit with the decision of going with the red color scheme. I felt like the red and the yellow stripes on the hat was reading a little bit like a popcorn bucket. Which I guess is not like the worst thing, since it actually gives off a retro kind of vibe, which I am into. But I did worry that it was going to start clashing a little bit with the blue of the background. But I've already made my bed, so this is what we're sticking with. Again, you see me starting with the blue around the edge of the shape, since I am imagining that the blue of the background is affecting the colors of the character. So I think in the past I would have maybe applied this blue after the fact, after I had applied the like local color of the whatever I'm working on, and then apply this like secondary color over top of it. But I am trying to just kind of do it all at once, because that's also the way to keep the color as pure, because I'm applying directly onto the white of the paper as opposed to applying to a previous layer of color, which would, you know, affect the color that I'm laying over top. I actually quite like how the character looks without the background, and it makes me realize that painting characters without a background is so much easier, because it's not as crucial to get the lighting right, because once you apply color for the background, that is going to change the context of the whole picture, and it might make the character look off, and you'll have to adjust either the character or the background, or probably both in my case. So yeah, it reminds me that making full illustrations like this with a character and a background is not easy. You know, I gotta give ourselves more credit for tackling such challenging images that require a lot of problem solving. Anyway, I digress. Starting to work on the background now. And again, I am trying to be brave and going dark right away instead of building up to it, which is what I would normally do, because I'm still under the delusion that I will be done with the background in a single layer. So when I went in to fill out the background, I made a mistake of using a brush that is probably a little bit too small, but that is because I had to navigate around the character shapes because I hadn't masked out the characters. And in hindsight, I probably should have masked out the characters, but I don't feel like I have the proper tool to do that, because right now I only have masking fluid, but the type of masking fluid I have, it's really finicky, and I imagine it would be really hard to mask quite a big area. I can only imagine using it in really small areas. So I'm curious to try this like masking film that I've seen some artists use, most notably Little Thunder. I know she uses it, and this other artist, I believe their name is Esper Isling or something like that. It kind of looks like a manga screen tone. It's like a thin layer of plastic or something, and then you lay it over the area, and then you cut out the shape with a knife. I'm curious about checking that out for the future, because it would make painting backgrounds like this so much easier. But yeah, past Chris definitely struggled painting around this character, and because I had to paint around smaller shapes, I used probably a too small of a brush. But also I used a smaller brush because I wanted to be able to switch quickly between colors, since I wanted the background to look varied in colors. I didn't want just like a uniformly dark blue. I wanted it to have a little bit of purple and a little bit of like a different kind of blue. Like I wanted it to look varied. So as I was filling out the background, I was grabbing like a little bit more purple, a little bit more blue, and kind of alternating and shifting the hues as I was working. But I'm thinking now that maybe I need to sacrifice the color variety for just being able to cover the ground more quickly, because I think the way I go about it produces a pretty patchy result. Yeah, I'm wondering if it would be better to use a bigger brush and just like cover a lot of ground quickly so that I'm not going in with like a million brush strokes and then worry about adding the different hues later, because I don't want the background to look super duper even either. You know, I want it to have a little bit of variance in terms of the colors, but I guess overall I still want to be a fairly dark value. So yeah, I think I'm trying to do a little bit too much. So it's definitely something I'm going to try to figure out going forward. Now I'm getting into the second pass on the character, which is when I am really starting to render things out, like the hair and bringing out the anatomy a little bit more. I feel like most people will read the big bubble as a tear, but it's actually meant to be a snot bubble, since I feel like that's what I had in my original drawing, and I feel like it adds a whimsical element to it, but let me know what you think. Did you think it was a tear? I mean, I think it could totally work as a tear as well. It's a little weird that that one is kind of floating up as opposed to the other tears that are falling down. So yeah, in my mind, it's a snot bubble. I end up getting rid of the ribbon ends on the bear to make it into more of a bow tie instead, since it felt a little bit too Christmassy for me. And I do that by wetting the area with clean water and dissolving the edges and picking up what I can with a tissue paper. Kind of ironic, teehee. It looks a little bit rough now, but I know I'll go over it later, so I am not too concerned. And this is what I really like about watercolors, which is the ability to lift up the paint. And no, it doesn't work perfectly, and it really depends on the like staining power of the paint that you're using. But for the most part, I feel like it is fairly flexible in that regard, especially if you know that you're going to be bringing other media over top. Though I was deluded in thinking I could do this in watercolors in 1 or 2 passes, in the back of my mind I knew I would be bringing in color pencils, and so I wasn't too concerned that you could still see a little bit of the ghosting of the ribbons. But yeah, I am recognizing that watercolor is actually a little bit more flexible than I sometimes give it credit. For example, on my last illustration here on my YouTube channel, my little Valentine's themed illustration with the angel and devil character, someone had commented that the tail on the devil looked a little bit too low, and I agreed. And at first I thought maybe I will just edit it digitally because I had already done the painting and I didn't really want to go back to it. But I realized that the tail was mostly done in watercolor, so I actually just took some water and I lifted it up and I repainted it, and honestly you can hardly tell that I did that. So yeah, I think watercolor can actually be quite flexible. So I really do appreciate the ability to be able to lift up the paint in watercolors. So you'll see me throughout the piece trying to darken the background and match the colors and the values to the color comp. It was hard because I think I'm going in pretty dark, but it keeps drawing lighter than I expected it to. And I'm wondering if that's because of the type of paints that I used. Specifically, this one paint, it's the neutral tint from Holbein. I really like that paint, and I like to mix it in whenever I want to deepen the value, but I don't want to affect the color too much because, as it says in the name, it's pretty neutral. But I do think this color definitely dries lighter than it appears. So maybe after a certain point, I should have mixed in other pigments into the mix to arrive at that darker color that I was after, but I was a little scared of bringing in other colors into the mix because maybe that will mess up the rest of the colors of the piece. So I didn't do that, and I just kept on trucking on. I really like how the glossy tiers bring in a different textural element to the piece. If you are quite familiar with my work, you may know that the tier shape is a visual motif that I use very often in my work, and I think it's in part for that reason. And having varied texture, I think, adds a level of interest and believable quality to the piece. While I continue to build up the rendering on the characters, as you can see, I am constantly going back into the background to darken it further since it has to read darker than the characters. Because the more I work on the characters, as you know in watercolor, you are going from light to dark, so more rendering means deepening the values. So because the value range is changing on the characters, the context of the whole piece changes, and that's why I keep going into the background to further darken it so that it as a whole reads darker against the character. I really didn't like how the bear was looking after the initial pass, but it started to look so much better with the second pass. So instead of shading smoothly, I applied in thin hair-like strokes to mimic the fuzzy teddy bear texture, and yeah, I think it made it look so much better, so much more like a teddy bear. And again, talking about textures, I think this kind of fuzzy texture is like a really nice addition to the varied type of materials in the piece. I really think being able to identify different types of materials lend a sense of richness to the piece, so that's something I've been really trying to incorporate into my work. I really wanted to keep the face looking exactly like the initial sketch, so I am constantly referring back to the sketch when working on the face. I know that the sketch is really small and it was a rough sketch, you know, it's not like a final drawing that I'm referencing off of. It's really a tonal sketch as well, so it was a little bit hard to follow, but I try my best. I really like the look of the like bright-eyed look with the wide eyes and the big eyelashes. So I was trying my best to match it as close to the drawing as possible. I spent a long time on the face, but it's really hard to tell in the video because a lot of the time I am just making like really subtle marks and changes, so it's really hard to tell in the video unless there's like a really big jump cut in between. But yeah, definitely spend more time on the face than the video implies. So you can probably see that I taped down the bottom right corner of the paper because it was lifting off the block. So this is an Arches watercolor block, and typically I really love using Arches, but this block that I have and had for a number of years, maybe I got a bad batch or something, but it has never kept the paper like onto the block. So as soon as I start working, it will start to lift off the block. So that makes it really annoying to work with, and I should have remembered this before I started working on this painting. It happened in the last illustration and it happened on this illustration. So I finally got fed up and I took a palette knife and I decided to take the paper off the block. And I tried working on it, but I actually kind of instant regretted it because it was actually so annoying to work with off the block. It was even more annoying because the edges curled up even more. I'm trying to show how curved the paper is, like when I just like set it flat on the table. It was getting so annoying to work because the paper was so warped. It was kind of like a seesaw, like it just wouldn't stay still. So I decided to use this hack that I would do in cases like this to help flatten out the paper, and that is by wetting the back of the paper and then putting really heavy books over top of it and letting it rest for a few days. I seem to recall that it did work in the past, or at least it like helped the situation a little bit. So yeah, basically I wet the back side of the paper and I put it face down and sandwiched it between some plastic sleeves to keep it protected. And I stacked some of my heaviest books on top of it. Oh, shameless plug, that's my art book tumble. Came back to it the next day, and when I took the books off, obviously the paper was still very damp, so I took a blow dryer to it, and as you can see, it's still quite warped. In fact, I think it somehow made it even worse than before. So yeah, you're probably cringing very hard at this, but I try to gently curl the edges back, and here's Oscar helping. He just knows when I'm in distress. So I'm just gently trying to curl the paper in the opposite direction, and I like massage it for a bit. And honestly, I think it helped quite a lot, but I worried that I would face the same issue again once I started painting. So I just resorted to sacrificing about a 1/4 inch around the border and just taped it down onto an MDF board. I was really annoyed about having to do this because I didn't want to sacrifice that border, you know, it changes up the composition of the image, but I just simply couldn't work on it while the paper was warped, so it had to be done. And thankfully it was a lot easier to work with once it was actually taped down. And at this point, I'm continuing to apply more and more paint in the background. By now, I've obviously given up on achieving that effortless watercolor look. So yeah, I just let myself go of the notion that this was going to look fresh and effortless and be done in one go, and just allowed myself to just use a lot of layers and go in as many times as I needed to. I finally hit that point in the painting where I feel I had done all that I could with watercolors, but it still didn't feel quite finished, and yet going further might risk overworking in some areas. So this is when I will bring in the color pencils. With the color pencils, I start by mostly just fixing some of those overworked areas where I may have gone a little bit too dark and muddy with the watercolors, and it did feel easier getting the face to look closer to the drawing with the color pencils, I guess because it is a drawing medium. And so yeah, it just made it a little bit easier. Again, with color pencils, I feel like it's really difficult to show all the minute little changes because I'm mostly using them to slightly lighten a value or slightly change the hue of a color. So they're very subtle changes. So yeah, apologies that I can't keep in as much of the color pencil footage as I would like. It just doesn't look like much is happening when I do that. Or you would have to be paying very close attention to the footage in order to see those changes. But even though the changes may be subtle, I think it makes a huge difference in the drawing for me, being able to adjust those values and those colors very slightly. And I start bringing in the color pencils into the background, and I apply it in a more visible way by deliberately creating a bit of contrast and drawing some like visible lines. So typically with color pencils, especially working in conjunction with another medium like watercolor, I don't usually use it in a way where the color pencil is very visible. Like I'll try to use it in a more subtle way, like I did with the face. Again, mostly to adjust values and the colors. But this time, I actually brought it in a more visible way into the background because I felt the background lacked a little texture. Like it did feel a little bit flat. I guess because I went over it so many times in watercolor, it just looked a little bit dead to me. So I kind of wanted to mimic the kind of energy of the lines that were in the original comp, the original sketch, with the color pencils and create a little bit more like interest in the background. So I am creating a little bit of this kind of pencil texture around the shoes and the little like alfalfa piece of curly hair and the snot bubble, where I felt like it could use a little bit more contrast to make those areas pop a bit. And I also use the color pencils with a very light hand now to glaze in more saturation into the background, since I felt parts of the background looked a little bit too gray. Again, probably because I used the neutral tint color by Holbein, and it was a very careful balancing act because I didn't want the background to be too saturated blue either, as I felt that would be a little bit too garish with the orange and the red of the characters. And with the color pencils, I add a little bit of a glow around the teddy bear and the tissue, and I draw it in lines as opposed to kind of softly shading it, because again, I wanted like a little bit more texture, and I thought that it would create a little bit of a sense of movement with the lines and a deeper connection between the clown and the teddy bear. At this point, I felt the piece was almost done, but I wasn't fully satisfied with the background, and yet I wasn't really sure what more to do. I decided I didn't really like this drippy edge that I created along the bottom, so I got rid of it as best as I could. Again, just wetting that whole area and then dabbing it with a tissue paper, and it honestly got rid of most of it instead of leaving like a little faint ghosting, which I was fine living with. I'm reminded again that watercolor is surprisingly flexible, and I also want to give myself a pat on the back for being a little bit less precious about making some of these decisions that I made throughout the piece. And I am going to try to continue to be less precious and, you know, make the decisions that I feel required to in that moment, depending on the circumstances that are presented. Because I think it's better to just move forward and deal with what's at hand as opposed to feeling stuck and like you can't do anything about it. You know, I want to get better at, I want to continue to exercise being more flexible with my art. But going back to the background, I wasn't sure what more to do at this point because I think I had achieved the value that I was after. Something about it just didn't feel finished, and I felt that the tears, the large tears falling from the character felt a little bit disconnected. So I decided to tie the tears to the character by drawing in raindrops in the background. Now, going into the piece, I wasn't sure that this was the route that I was going to take, and I can't help but feel like it's like a little bit of a cop-out, but I feel like the background really called for it because it feels really kind of misty, you know, and so it kind of makes sense, and the tears just felt a little bit too separated from the character otherwise. I hadn't imagined the background being rainy. I think I imagined the floor being kind of like water because I did intend on there being ripples like under the tear. But yeah, I ended up just going in and drawing little raindrops and little lines for rain falling. And doing that really, I think, helped connect the tear to the character, and it really just kind of brought the whole background to life. And I am really glad that I went in this direction because honestly I don't really know what else I could have done, and I felt that this was like a really simple kind of solution and one that didn't take too much time, and it was really easy to do. And if I didn't like how that looked, I imagine it wouldn't be too difficult to erase some of those lines back out. Now, in hindsight, I kind of wish I had given the bear maybe like a little clear umbrella. I think it would add a little bit more interest to the piece. I actually explored that concept in my sketchbook once I decided I was going to paint this illustration, but went against it because, again, I wasn't thinking of making it rainy in the background. But yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think of this direction of making it rain? I remember I mentioned this in my previous illustration video, how I like these kind of abstract, void-like backgrounds, but I often don't really know how to treat it. So it's a bit of a challenge every time in trying to make the piece feel finished. I'm wondering if these kinds of backgrounds would be a lot easier to do in oils because the paint would remain wet and it would make it easier to push and pull paint around, and I can really have fun with like varying up the colors and just playing around with shapes and just being able to move things around like on the canvas. Just being able to move elements around live, I think is what I would really like to do when I make art. But yeah, watercolor is a little bit more challenging in that regard, I think. But maybe that's just me. I think I maybe just need more practice as well. So at this point, I felt that this piece was finished. So I peeled off the tape, and as I expected, it revealed a very clear border because I had painted to the edge of the tape, and because I went darker and darker, it just like left a very visible edge. On one hand, I thought it kind of looked cool and almost intentional, but I knew that it would drive me up the wall in the long run. So I first tried matching the color as best as I could with watercolor, and then I go over top of it with a little bit of color pencil, and to my surprise, it honestly looks fairly seamless. Like, if I didn't mention it and you saw the finish, I don't know that you would be able to tell that there was this like border that I filled in after the fact. So in the end, I am happy that I did not trim or crop off the edges and just kept it, because it just allows for more flexibility when you want to go make a print or something. Having more of the background is definitely helpful. So I actually tried flattening the paper out again after I was done, but this time I had the books on the artwork for several days, and I do think that helped quite a bit. It's still not like perfectly flat, but it's a lot better, and I am done with the painting at this point, so I'm happy to move on, and this is good enough. But yeah, lesson learned: the next time I use that Arches block, I will start off by taping the edges down first, or I will just take the sheet off the block and stretch it and tape it down onto an MDF board instead of the runaround that I did on this painting. So while I was completely delulu in thinking that this piece was going to take just 1 or 2 passes, my takeaway is that watercolor may actually be a little bit more flexible and resilient and forgiving than I give it credit, and maybe I shouldn't feel so bad about using as many layers as I do, because it's just not that serious. As long as I finish the illustration and I get my point across at the end of the day, maybe it doesn't matter exactly how I got there. If you like this video, don't forget to leave me a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos like this in the future. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!